Welcome to the Transport Leaders podcast, where we discuss the breakthrough ideas and bold solutions transforming the future of transport around the world. Join a global community of transport leaders, professionals, academics, and advocates as we unpack transport's toughest challenges and spotlights on the strategies driving real change. From system reform levers and political realities to sustainability and technological disruptions, join me, McCabe, and Russell King, and our guests as we offer expert perspectives as we discuss how to transform our transport systems. G'day, I'm McCabe. I'm the founder of Step Advisory, a transport planning and traffic engineering firm, and I've worked in consultancy and government for over 25 years across Australasia and Asia.
Hello, I'm Russell King. I'm a transport strategist and the founder of the Transport Leader blog and newsletter. I've worked on the policy side of transport for around 20 years. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Russell. By the time this comes out, it'll be the new year, so happy new year, Russell, in advance.
Happy new year to you too, Graham. We'll drink to toast to all the things it has to deliver for us and for the listeners, and also for our transport systems around the world.
Okay, Russell, what are we going to talk about today? I'm pretty
Hey,
sure
Graham,
this is a simple one.
Sorry? What did you say about number one?
I said I'm pretty sure this is a simple one.
Oh, this is a simple one. Yeah, let's do something really straightforward and easy. Every transport system around the world is absolutely exceptional at, which is integrating transport and land use. What can possibly be difficult about that? Well,
we've talked about transport and land use before, and I think a good guiding principle is that transport is a land use, but it's also a means to an end. Whereas so much of what's done in transport systems is thinking about the network and the projects, not why you have those things.
Okay, let's start on that point. Okay, what do we mean by integrated transport and land use to start with? What do we actually mean? It sounds kind of like, it says on the tin, but is more. What is it we're actually talking about here?
So land use is how do we use land? So is it used for housing, factories, hospitals, schools, etc.?
Rail stations. Yeah. Roads. Yeah. Parking.
Yeah. Trains, buses, the various networks. So actually making sure that the needs of people and goods in terms of their transport needs actually align with land use needs. So if we go way back that when towns and cities were small, you would have and this actually still occurs in lots of parts of the world. You may have a factory next to a shop, both of which had the housing for the owners of those things right behind them. And people would come and collect what they needed. If it's a factory, they may collect a part and take it to their own factory that was also associated with the house. And as you get more and more industrialized, you create more and more disbenefits. So pollution, localized pollution, air pollution, water pollution. So we started separating those things out. And I suppose at its worst case, we ended up with the single zone system where you only have a single type of land use on any parcel of land. And then you separate out all the dirty land uses away from where people live. So, and that's one of the things that enabled the rise of suburbia and car dependency. You put all the housing away from the dirty industries, and also the shops and the jobs.
Yeah. Now,
so each ends up with, and so that creates the imbalance of needing a massive transport system in order to enable people to get to their day-to-day activities.
yeah. So for me, the important thing here is that there is a feedback mechanism between the land use and the transport and the land use.
Yes.
And they both impact on each other. And therefore, if you're thinking about one individually, then you typically have unintended consequences on the other.
Yeah. So the land uses create the demand for transport. And the more you separate them out, or the more imbalance there is between people and where people are and the land uses they need to go to, then the more you induce travel demand. So using the single family dwelling zoning example, if you have a low density environment, then you have to travel to get your basic needs. So you have to travel to the shops to get food if you're not growing it yourself. And if your shops don't also have the type of job that you're doing, then you also have to travel to that job. So you may have 2 trips, whereas if your shops and jobs are located together, you'll have 2 trips, but the distance between the job and the shop is much smaller and could possibly be walked, which is obviously it's your highest short distance capacity mode is walking. So people talk about how many units we can fit in a width of a transport system. So, it's classic diagrams of, well, you can fit 10,000 people per hour on a footpath and you can only fit 1,000 cars. Yep. But those 10,000 people can only travel 4 kilometers in that hour.
Yes.
Whereas those 1,000 cars can travel 60, 100, well, probably 30 kilometers.
Yes.
Realistically.
So that's the how the land use affects demand for transport. But transport also has a feedback mechanism on the demand for different land uses as well, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah. So we've talked a lot about induced demand. So, a lot of suburbs around the world grew up around tramway or train systems. So, and in fact, a lot of developers in the early 1900s were tramway companies. And railway companies. They would buy big parcels of land and they would build a train line or a train line out to them as a speculative activity. So, the people who don't understand the historical context of railways think railways have always been a public good. Railways have always been a commercial private operation that happened to be subsidized by government as car dependency rose.
Yes.
And more often than not, with land speculation.
Yes. The world's first metro system was the Metropolitan line in London. And it was exactly...
The railways weren't allowed to build into central London.
That's right. So they couldn't go across central London because basically that's where the people who lived in who were in Parliament owned the land. And so they didn't want their land being interrupted in that way, and so they banned it. But the Metropolitan line model was exactly as you described. The railway was built to basically enable the land use to happen and to increase the value of the land, so that it created, suburbia, with people being able to go into the city of London and the jobs in London via the Metropolitan line. That's what enabled the first metro line to be built, which was built privately, as you say. The other, but it has more than just. There's a whole bunch of feedbacks here, isn't there, as well? In that, if you have lots of people wanting to use cars, that also drives different types of land uses.
it does. It drives car-oriented land uses, and that's where you get into our very first episode. That's where you end up creating stroads. Is you
Yeah.
do things that enable people to move in cars and stay in cars and kind of isolate themselves from the surrounding systems. So
Yeah. And it creates yeah, and so that's another topic we've covered, commuter car parks. It's a similar sort of story. It's also in terms of induced demand and adding more lanes. Again, it's because people like to drive, so they think that more lanes is the solution, and therefore we end up with more lanes using up the land use. But it also increases then demand for the types of housing that you've got. So you've got, I think, in terms of car dependent suburbs, which are very common these days, that we've built over the last 50 years or so without mass public transport options. Those have become in demand because of the car's flexibility in a way.
Yeah, and the cars, for all their societal ills, they have enabled a lot of flexibility. So you take factories, for example. So factories, historically, very polluting, getting cleaner and cleaner over time, but they still generate noise and lots of truck activity. So they've been pushed to the edges of cities. So when you then have housing that springs up on the edges of the cities as well, then it becomes really hard to serve a low density factory area with public transport that actually connects all those workers. So you have a mesh of people whose paths are all crossing over each other. So I live in suburb A and want to go to a factory in suburb D, and you live in suburb B and want to go to factory in suburb C. We can't, unless you have high frequency, highly subsidized buses. It becomes very hard to create networks that serve those trips. Little aside, I'd recommend people look at Jarrett Walker's work on public transport planning. I mean, you can serve low density areas well with public transport, but it's a choice that you have to make, and you have to be very deliberate about it. You can't just go, we'll run buses from the nearest railway station without actually thinking about where people are coming from.
Yes. So those are kind of all examples which have created, how to describe it, a situation where we haven't really thought hard about the integration of land use and transport. We've tended to think about these things in separate buckets. But there are examples, but there are examples now of much closer thinking about transport and land use together. So I'm thinking about things like transit-oriented developments or transport-oriented developments, TODs, okay, which is mixed-use developments around stations, typically stations.
Yeah, so that alleviates one problem, which is having mixed-use development around good transit serves your need for local services and access to retail for food, and supports people who work in the service economy. So people who are going to other transit-oriented developments or major centres. It doesn't support people who work in the production economy. So if you live in a town centre that has good public transport, and you're going out to one of the factories, you're very unlikely to have the type of transport that will support you. So you end up needing a car. So it can bring down the amount of car usage. It can bring it down for services and opportunities trips and everyday needs trips by a very, very substantial amount. And it can address the people who work in the service economy who are traveling to work. But often we still have a problem in the English-speaking world of the land use planning and the transport planning is too segregated. So I've done a number of integrated transport strategies in my career. I've managed to do one integrated land use and transport strategy.
Sorry, just to pause you there. When you say integrated transport strategy,
integrated between the modes.
Integrated between the modes. Good. Thank you. Yes. Just to clarify. Yes.
So
I thought that's what you meant, but I just wanted to double check. Yes, as opposed to an integrated transport and land use strategy, which is integrating both the transport modes and the land use.
Yes. Yeah. So because what often happens is the two parts, local government unit, provincial, state unit, national unit, they're working at different paces. So you may have a project-related land use strategy, and we've talked about that with the high-speed rail and also Sydney Metro. But having an area-wide integrated strategy is actually quite rare, because, I've seen this with one project that I worked on recently, where there was a housing strategy, retail centres strategy, and economic development strategy. The housing strategy said we can't put more housing where the public transport network is because there's not enough services. The centre strategy said, well, we don't have the housing supply, so we're not going to increase the density of retail and childcare and etc. The transport strategy said, well, you've got all these targets, but your land use doesn't actually match what your targets are. So if you don't have them working at the same pace and in tandem, then you get these disconnects. So you can have the housing people saying, we can't increase housing, there isn't the public transport people, there isn't the public transport. And there's public transport people saying, we don't have the demand for public transport. We can't increase services because we have all these other places that need services. And somebody has to bite the bullet. And usually it's the housing side of things that ends up biting the bullet.
Yeah.
To drive the demand for services.
Yeah. And when you say the housing is the thing, as in we do less housing, is that what you mean?
No, we do more. No. So you look at the transit-oriented developments that are happening in places where housing prices are escalating rapidly and there's a lack of supply. So again, English-speaking developed world. The governments are responding by increasing the housing supply, knowing that the transit service won't be able to keep up with it, which then can embed car dependency, because the people who move in, even in locations where there's transit-oriented developments, you may have a transit-oriented development in a place that actually doesn't have a good frequency of transport or doesn't connect to where the people who move in will want to go. So,
yeah,
in Southwest Sydney, in Leppington and Edmondson Park, which are near the new Western Sydney Airport, there's a lot of 6 to 10 story residential development going in. It is mixed use, so it's got retail, community centres, childcare, etc. But those people aren't travelling on the railway lines that the housing is being placed next to. They're going in a different arc, which one day in the future is being promised, loosely promised a railway line, but at the moment doesn't exist.
Yeah. An added complication I've seen is transport saying, oh, this line is at capacity. Okay, and therefore you can't put more housing here. Okay, it's often the road system that's at capacity, allegedly, as well.
Yeah.
But we'll get on to that in a second, because I think that's a separate discussion. But on the rail line, I've seen this capacity, but what they actually mean is it's at capacity for half an hour a day, 3 days a week. Typically Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, when, you know, especially post-COVID, people are more hybrid working. They don't actually mean it's a capacity. They mean it's a capacity for an hour and a half a week, 30 minutes a day, 3 days a week, which, you know, I asked this of one of the leading professors of transport, and he went and he just shrugged and said, so what? You know, people will retime or redo their journeys, you know, accordingly. Okay. You know, there's plenty of, you know, you don't justify increasing services for 30 minutes for 3 days, you know, 30 minutes a day, 3 days a week. You know, just you're better off just spreading the demand. You know, you use pricing or just simply the level of congestion to spread the demand, you know, across the piece. But what we're doing is we use it because it's not being thought about properly strategically. It's being used as an excuse not to put the housing in, you know, or to object to the housing. But let's go back.
Well, or it's being used to justify wish list road projects that don't actually do anything to solve the root problem. So
yes, and one of the challenges here is historically the way we think about roads has been forecast and supply, right, or predict and supply. Right.
Yeah, predict provides the industry term for it. Yeah. Yes.
Right. Whereas there's a lot of people now saying, actually, what we should be thinking about is what the vision is for the transport system around an area is, and designing accordingly. And therefore, what you're looking at is what we're going to be doing is we're going to be mode shifting significantly in this area, and the new housing is part of that transition, not a disabler of the road system, because the road system, it's not that we're going to increase the amount of cars, it's because we're going to switch people's modes by prioritizing buses, walking, cycling, more mixed use, etc. Right, and that's a very different.
There is a big flaw in that approach, which is some work that research I've been doing recently, which is it treats people as homogenous groups. Yep. So, for example, in Melbourne, where people who live in certain industries are traveling to depends on. Traveling from and to depends on their income. But what the way the vision and validate process works, and the flaw in it, you know, which is also one in the predict and provide, is that it treats people of certain income levels as homogenous. So doctors and lawyers are substitutable within the models. So doctors obviously go to hospitals, hospital precincts, you know, that's where their consulting rooms are, or the hospitals. Lawyers go to generally CBDs.
Yeah.
But within the models, those trips are substitutable. So if you create a new railway line that connects doctors to hospitals, which Suburban Rail Loop in Melbourne actually will do a bit, then it will say all those lawyers will actually change where they work, and it'll be in hospital precincts, because we don't get down to that level of resolution. Most of the models are blue collar or white collar or production versus services jobs. And then they stratify by income and car ownership and family type. They don't use, if they use industry categories, it's at the very top level. They never get down to the second level. So they don't disaggregate where doctors live versus where nurses live. They just, if you have a high paid nurse or a nurse practitioner, that nurse practitioner gets treated the same as doctors within the models, and lawyers and engineers.
Yeah. Now, does that have a problem? Because what it does is, at the bottom end of the modeling, is it overestimates the mode shift potential? Is that the challenge?
Well, generally models will underestimate the mode shift away from cars.
Yes. So because isn't that what we're trying to achieve here with the vision thing? Is more.
So there's a distributional equity effect, and there's been a lot of work on how transit actually gentrifies areas.
Yeah.
So new transit lines, they change the type of people who live around them, because they're people who have demand for using transit.
If you let's go through it basic. If you make an area more desirable to live in, either through better transit, better schools, better green space, less crime,
prices go up. Yeah.
Okay, prices go up, and if prices go up, then the people that move in are people that can afford those prices, and so you change the demographic of that area.
Yeah. So what the models generally don't do, unless it's a very targeted analysis for a business case, is look at those effects. So the population that's in the model that's set there for the future is the population that's in the model for the future.
Okay. So,
and because they're called common planning assumptions.
Yeah,
so they don't say, actually, this new railway line it's going to attract all the people who want to live near a railway line, because it connects people to the destination. So you'll have a population turnover.
Yes. Now, so what does that mean for transport? What's the bottom line in terms of the transport impact of that?
So we consistently overestimate the demand for cars and underestimate the demand for other modes when we increase density, and when we increase density of public transport services.
Okay. Yeah. So it's not really invalidating the vision methodology, or the vision, the vision philosophy, I should say. But what it was saying is the methods we currently use to understand what the impact of a vision would be requires work. It's a work in progress. Is that fair?
Yeah. So I
mean, it's a relatively new approach, isn't it?
Well, it's
okay. In terms of maturity of the approach,
so it used to be called decide and provide. Okay, so there was predict and provide and decide and provide.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to build so the new towns in the UK, I suppose, for
Keynes being a good example.
For all the post-war. Yes, we know cars are a coming thing, but we will provide good buses, good trains, good pathways. Like, you can go all over Milton Keynes, on a bike without having to actually interact with a road. That's, the closest approximate of that in Australia is Canberra, and Canberra you still have to interact with roads. So that's the, the decide and provide historical approach. So vision and validate is a new branding, but it also says, well, actually we will test it in the transport models to make sure we think it's feasible. So when you're doing a vision and validate, you come up with a vision and then you work out how much traffic you need to make to evaporate through other means. So increasing land use density, changing land use mixes, providing alternate modes.
And one of the challenges here is it's a dynamic, because the less cars that you accommodate, the higher the traffic evaporation is.
Yep.
Right? So you're not chasing a fixed thing. Right? It's kind of like 2 lanes give you this, 1 lane give you that. They feedback loops on each other. So it's not so see, if we go with 2 loops, you're back in then into your predict and provide kind of model, aren't you?
Yeah, and the issue is largest when we go from very low density areas that scale up massively, or we go from industrial areas into new residential development.
Yeah.
So apologies for the Sydney centric example again. So Green Square, which sits between the Sydney CBD and Sydney Airport, is an area that was a large industrial area. In fact, had a naval depot taking up a good chunk of it, a historic, a race course. Started to get redeveloped in the 1990s, and all the land use planning, traffic modelling, etc., said, Carmageddon will have 4 kilometres long queues going out each side of this precinct.
Yeah.
All these people moved in who were either going to Sydney CBD or the University of New South Wales, which is 2 to 3 kilometres away, along a bus route.
Yeah.
Or
along a frequent bus route. I mean, there's buses going there.
Yes.
Now light rail as well.
Yeah. So, and they had a train station which had a significant penalty fare on it to use the station as opposed to using the line. So it had a surcharge. So when the first people moved in, there was some car usage, but it very quickly became apparent that the trip generation rates for cars that had been assumed weren't anything like what was happening.
Yeah.
And as more and more development occurred, the same car parking rates were being applied, which is fine. A car that's sitting still doing nothing doesn't actually hurt the transport system if it's off street. But what happened was that it was very quickly identified that the bus system could not cope. So the car system had been oversupplied for, and the bus system had been undersupplied for. So that was developed using a predict and provide approach.
Nice. That's a nicer problem to have. Let's be frank about it, right? I mean, that's like if that's the problem most cities had right now, they'd go like, I'd swap that problem for the current problem they have, right? Which is normally too many cars and inadequate public transport. Inadequate demand for public transport, let alone.
Yeah. So the first separated cycleway, that long length that the City of Sydney built was from Green Square to get people up to the Sydney CBD, because it's like, okay, we want to do separated cycleways. We have this problem with transport congestion. What can we do? Well, it's like, okay, well, let's start building cycleways between the Sydney CBD and Green Square. So we did Green Square, then so we did Burke Street, then we did some other ones in the industrial area. And then we do George Street, which is a parallel street to Bourke Street. So they connected two different parts of the CBD. So this is George Street in Redfern and Alexandria. It is actually the same street as George Street in the city CBD, except there's a railway line in the way that cut it off historically.
Okay.
So that was to ease congestion, and then but also places, other redevelopment areas, Docklands has a massive, in Melbourne, has a massively wide road network within the actual areas where people live and work, not just the arterials that are surrounded, for no cars, because it's, again, the system has been supplied based on the wrong metrics.
So let me characterize where we're going on this discussion at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, which I think has been, we need to integrate transport and land use, and quite frankly, it's all transport's fault because it has no idea about what the demand will be from particular land uses. It has a tendency to overestimate car use, especially in sort of higher density uses and mixed use areas. And so it's all transport's fault.
No, it's also land use fault.
But I'm obviously, I'm being cheeky on this one.
Yeah. But going back to the housing strategies that said, the housing and retail strategies that said we can't have more housing because there's no public transport. We can't have more retail because there's no public transport. So land use is, I suppose, blaming transport for their own inertia in that regard.
Yeah. Now, I think there's one of the things I want us to explore in this discussion is why it is so hard to get the transport planners and the urban planners to collaborate effectively. Because I think that's one of the challenges. And there's a whole bunch of things about why that is. Because when I first started in transport, right, it was as a councillor, and we did not have separate transport planning and urban planning departments. So I became a cabinet member for strategic planning and transport. And by strategic planning, it meant strategic planning of transport and land use. So they were all integrated. Okay, so there was no separation in terms of the politically, and even within the the council officers and the council bureaucracy, it was all integrated, right? So the transport planners and the urban planners were in the same teams.
And in a lot of councils, the transport planners and the strategic planners are in the same team. In Australia. So often what will happen is that the transport planning activity will be in the strategic transport, in the strategic planning arm, and the traffic engineering will be in the engineering arm. So the, I suppose, the drawing lines on a map is in the strategic. The putting lines out on the road is in the engineering arm.
Yes, and that's a really important as well as a distinction, because certainly that was my experience as well. Although I had both reporting into me, both arms. Yeah. So I had both the engineering arms and also the planning arms, which enabled me to sort of theoretically resolve any issues between the two. But what we see in a lot of places is completely separate departments, so urban planning and transport planning in separate departments. We also see separate politicians responsible for them. So the Minister for Planning is different to the Minister for Transport and Roads. And so you don't get that. For me, is one of the challenges. So you've got that's the kind of governance challenge, in that you're trying to get, and let's be frank about it, lots of government departments are very siloed. both siloed across departments, but also within departments. And so you end up with that challenge. So they then getting them to work together is really hard. But I also think there is a cultural blockage between urban planners and transport planners as well. I think perhaps less between urban planners and transport planners, but maybe more between, as you mentioned, urban planners and transport engineers. Is that fair?
So, well, I suppose it depends on the transport engineers. So the ones who are very focused on the mechanical things, so the line on the ground, the sign at the end of the street, yes, they aren't great at communicating with urban planners, but the ones who are thinking about the system and how the system works, they can be a bit better. But engineering has lots of maths in it, so there's a lot of people who are very focused on the maths. So
yes,
I did a LinkedIn post last week about one of the motorways, and in the technical reports for the EIS, the modelers were very proud about how well they had calibrated their model, and they'd included that in the report.
Some people doing really great research that's really tackling those kind of fundamental problems, but the amount of research I see that is kind of tackling the edges, we go on a priority basis, is this really tackling the big problems? And the answer is, in large numbers, no, not really. This is just a very small issue. There are some really good examples, though, of integration and transport land use at a system level. And in particular, I'm thinking about somewhere like Singapore.
So Singapore even has its disagreements between the LTA and the URA. So the URA,
that's the urban planning arm.
Yeah, its job is to plan the future land use of Singapore, and LTA's job is to plan the transport system and operate it and manage it. But Singapore has a lot of roads, and it has a lot of big roads, and it has a lot of roads that are hostile to pedestrians and bicycle riders. It's done really well on the MRT, so the trains and the buses, but and it's trying to change on walking and cycling. But if you're a pedestrian at grade, so at street level in Singapore, you're very much a second-class citizen.
Yeah. One of the things I think is interesting in the Singapore model, and I think about this in comparison to somewhere like Australia or the United States or Canada, is they seem to be much more focused on every single bit of land because they have so little of it.
Yeah, it's quite funny. Like, I'm a sad person who goes on random walks in every place that they go to just to see what the normal areas are.
Yeah.
And Singapore has a lot of land that's waiting for redevelopment. So is currently whatever was there is being demolished.
Yeah.
And is not yet being redeveloped. And like I was a couple of years ago, I was in Little India, and this area may be being completely redeveloped. But just outside the main areas was vast swathes of unkempt, wild, weed infested wild land that was fenced off, just waiting for redevelopment.
Yeah.
And they have that all over the place, and they're always creating new land and looking for new opportunities. But when they do their developments, they make sure it's close to or is connected to the MRT or one of the light rail lines. So they're funny little people movers that they have, so that it's integrated. But then, yeah, they still have tons and tons of wide roads, including through the centre of their CBD, which okay, most people want to be underground in the air conditioning, out of the heat and humidity, but it's not. Yeah, it's very much not a environment designed for living outside.
Yeah, but I mean, Singapore's roads, I mean, I might be correct on this. It feels like they were much more of the legacy of the planning of the time rather than the direction they're going in now. So a lot of the stuff I read is about, we have too much land committed to roads, and we need to reduce that over time.
Yeah. Is that from the LTA or the URA though?
That's a very good question, and I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Yeah, I would suspect it's more the URA.
Yeah, the planners rather than
yeah. So URA, for example, wants to completely redesign Orchard Road. The prime high-end shopping strip, which is it's a traffic sewer in the middle of it, and the way you get across the road generally is by going underground.
Yeah.
So yeah. Whereas for the LTA, Orchard Road is has a lot of buses, and there's a lot of very expensive cars driving down it. So it's your classic conflict between land use and transport, and urban design.
Yeah. Oh, maybe it's not then. So, are there any examples that you would point to then that you think are really good in this space?
Well, I mean, in terms of integrating land use and transport, I think I really like the Japanese model of land use, which is there are certain land uses which can't be in urban or residential areas, but everything else is allowed.
Yes.
So basically, if it's toxic or super noisy, it can't be in an urban or residential area. So, you do have a lot of people running shops out from the front of their house, which in Australia we do allow a little bit, but it's more where you can run your business or your hair salon, but selling food or opening a cafe in the front of your shop, that's not going to be allowed. In the front of your house, that's not going to be allowed, because you got to provide parking. So the the free for all approach, which is supported by good public transport and highly subsidized, and the further you get out of the major metropolitan areas, the more and more subsidized it becomes, and they maintain it, though they are starting to shut down more and more railway lines.
So Japan's a really interesting example for a number of reasons as well. So going back to our discussion earlier about the Metropolitan line and it actually being a land project rather than a rail project, right? A lot of the Japanese rail operators, which is privatized, that's a very heavy. The use of development to support the rail lines is a very significant proportion of their operations, their commercial operations.
And it's how they were before they were taken over by government. So people will be getting a sense of the YouTube channels I follow, but Life Where I'm From, which is a Canadian who lives in Japan. He's just put out a very good video about how a lot of rural railway lines in Japan have managed to stay alive, and that's basically through local government funding or through running by larger operators using the tracks.
Yeah.
But yeah. No, it's not the panacea everybody thinks it is.
No. I mean, everywhere's got its challenges, whichever places you look at. I think the other thing I think that's interesting about Japan as well is, take somewhere like Tokyo, you can't get a car unless you have a parking space.
Well, and there's no on-street parking.
And there's no on-street parking, right? So, they have things that, would make it less desirable to have a car.
Well, though car ownership, again, so this is the difference between car ownership and car usage. So you don't have to get very far from even a major railway station in Tokyo to where you're getting very small but tightly clustered single family housing. So it's more terraces where the front part of the property is taken up by a car parking space, and it will be a very small car, possibly a K car or something a little bit bigger. It's not going to be your trucks or but the car stays there sitting. It's not on the road. So and the thing that dense land use enables is it doesn't matter if you own a car, because you can still get all the things you need by not using a car. And as you increase the mixes, so a supermarket supports 10,000 people roughly if it's a full-line supermarket. So you can have your 10,000 people clustered. You can have them all on top of each other in high rises. You can have them in 2 to 3 story terraces, or you can have them in single family dwellings. So the amount of area that it needs to take to provide those 10,000 residents increases and increases. So by the time you're getting out to 10,000, if you've got 600 square meter lots, then you're actually getting too far away for it to be walkable. It'd be an okay bike ride with an electric bike, but it's easiest with a car.
Yeah.
So once you get that density effect, and the people who are working in those supermarkets can also live close by. So you're getting the people who are working in the supermarkets able to walk or cycle. You get the people who are going to the supermarkets able to walk and cycle. And it doesn't matter if they own a car. If they want to spend the money on owning a car and having space, then that's I suppose a choice thing. Unless we go back to last week's podcast where we're forcing people not to own cars.
Yeah. Not personally in favour of that particular option, but
very useful.
But I'm just against the subsidies of cars, which I think is the source of a lot of our problems. Right, it's the encouragement of cars through subsidies that's our challenge. But okay, we're coming out to our hour of discussion. I think we're aligned on integrating transport and land use is a good thing if you can do it. Right? What advice would we give to people who say this is how you can do a better job of integrating transport and land use? What would be our key recommendations? Yeah. What should you be doing on this? I mean,
so as a consultant, sometimes you'll get issued a brief for an integrated transport strategy.
Yep.
And obviously it's very hard to say, actually, no, you shouldn't be doing this, because consultants need to earn income. But once you've, well, I would say, submit a conforming and a non-conforming bid, which the non-conforming should include land use. But if you're getting the work, the first question should be, what's your land use plan?
Yeah.
And same with,
what if you're a consultant?
Simple questions. Are the land use planners part of your project team? And same for the land use planners. Is what's the involvement of the transport people? Have you thought about how this is going to generate trips? So, and one of the areas, plug for myself, where I've been quite successful as a consultant is saying to people who are doing development, hang on, you might think you're going to make a nice healthy profit, but your development as it is going to generate a lot of traffic because you don't have a good mix of land uses. That is going to result in you having to pay for road upgrades, which you don't have funded at the moment.
Yeah.
Let's have a talk about the land use. Is there a better way to do your land use mix where you may be capturing some of those trips? So, if you're going to do a purely residential development and the nearest supermarket's a kilometre away, could you have a small supermarket as part of the development to reduce some of the trips that you would otherwise be creating?
Yeah.
How well is a place connected to walking and cycling? So, and this is where a whole other group of people, property economists, become they need to be in the conversation, because
indeed,
a developer is thinking about the profitability of their development, and they're told that a residential unit, gets you X dollars, and a car park, you have to provide car parking because otherwise you're costing yourself, Y dollars in your development costs.
I think where we get to is you want to have mixed teams. Is that fair? Is that what we're saying here? Is that you want to have mixed discipline teams? So you want to have, on whatever it is you're looking at, could be a transit development, could be one of the things we haven't touched on, and we'll touch on it another time, I think, is the integration of transport and land use for transport projects, which I think is an interesting discussion point as well. But I think what we're saying is you've got to have teams, multidiscipline teams is a must. I would also add
they have to value each other as well.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just put them in the same room and then hate each other and throw knives at each other. And there's a really good example I can think of. I won't name any names, but I can think of a jurisdiction where the relationship between the planners and the transport is so bad that, in effect, the planners gave up on collaborating with the transport people and hired their own transport people to provide answers to the questions because they didn't feel that they could work with the transport department. Right?
Yeah, I could think of a number of places like that. So.
Yes, which is far from ideal, but it's kind of where you end up with if they can't work together. The other thing I would say is that there's a governance thing here as well, in that if you have two separate political ministers, that creates a challenge as well in terms of how do you incorporate those two together. So there's a kind of how do you deal with issues where, which is very common, is that the transport minister's being briefed to say this doesn't work from a transport perspective, and the planners, say, and the urban planners are briefing up to the planning minister and saying this isn't going to work, from our perspective because the transport's in the way, and then they've got to kind of come together on that point, and they're both being briefed in opposite ways, right, with different lenses and different disciplines. You have to have a way of dealing with that and resolving those conflicts.
Yeah, well, and it needs to be done before it gets to the ministers.
Ideally, absolutely. Yeah. But
who's going to make the call in the case? It's going to be whoever the highest level person is, premier, provincial leader, governor, and whoever's in charge of the Treasury Department.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, normally I think it would be a discussion around a subcommittee, a cabinet, etc. Potentially an infrastructure committee where you're discussing the, you know, and then it'll depend on the priorities of the individuals. But as you say, you really want them to be coming together. But as we know, they're not really coming together, are they? So there's a kind of, how do you facilitate them coming together to resolve these issues when they can't seem to do it themselves? Perhaps it's a third party, and perhaps that's, you know, we've all got, you know, the governments tend to have, you know, departments of premier or prime minister and cabinet, etc. What I find though is that their role doesn't tend to, it tends to create a bunch of compromises solution that doesn't work for anyone, right?
Yeah, and
that actually gives you does not give you the most desirable outcome, because they don't want to upset anyone. So it's kind of like, let's compromise between the two rather than actually set a distinctive, this is the right direction of travel that we need to go in. And that's kind of why I think it's very challenging in getting the different departments to work together.
Well, and I think it goes back to our other discussion about briefing an incoming transport minister. I don't think we talked about the fact that transport ministers need to align with planning ministers as part of that. So if they're not being, you know, briefed on, hey, there's a disconnect between our entire land use system and our entire transport system, you know, would you like to be the brave soul to fix that, minister?
Yeah, and I we'll touch on it in another time, but it's like, if you have a significant metro project, okay, critical to success of that metro project holistically is also the land uses that are going to be around those stations.
I worked on a number of land use plans around metro stations.
Yeah. Okay. And so if you don't have the Minister for Planning in the tent, right, then your metro project will be much less successful than it should be. I also think it then ends up with, it adds weight to the argument for Treasury departments to go, you need to save money on this project, cut the number of stations down. On a metro project, that's exactly the opposite of what you want to do. Yeah. But, you know, that's, you know, by the by, I think if you're not thinking about the land uses as well as the transport project itself, then that becomes easier to do because we're not thinking holistically about these projects in the way that we need to.
Yeah, well, and it also gets into the whole aspect of what's valued in transport economics. And I think we touched on it in the high-speed rail talk.
Yes.
Of, you know, coming up with an airy-fairy land use plan, which isn't potentially grounded in reality or, you know, involved people who may actually do that type of development.
Yeah, and I've seen, unfortunately, a lot of this, what I would classify as utopian urban planning thinking, without understanding the underlying realities of that development, whether it's the economics of it or other aspects of it. It's considered what they ideally would want, nor what is realistic in terms of the financials. Whether that's, I've seen, you know, proposals of, you know, government's gonna have to spend billions to make this work when government hasn't got the money, so that's not going to fly. Or the private sector, you know, will have to pay for all of this, and it just doesn't make the economics stack up. You know, either way, that's not a realistic urban plan.
Yeah, or well, actually, sometimes the private sector stepping in and saying, well, "We'll deliver this." You know, you give us increased density, which is very much the, you know, the private sector railways model is, you know, you let us develop more and will deliver an outcome.
Indeed, and that's
can be very, very successful.
And that's what we did with 9 Elms. So those that don't know, I was involved in the 9 Elms regeneration zone when I was in London, and it was a very land constricted development area and needed a mass transit solution if you really wanted to maximize the densities in the area. And the developers, proposed paying significantly increased infrastructure contributions to fund an extension to the Northern Line metro system. And that was that, and a combination of a business rate uplift payment was basically how the Northern Line extension got funded and is now operational. Right.
And it makes very good sense from an integrating land use and transport perspective. Because, sometimes developers aren't evil.
I have to say, most of the time, I would say. I think unfortunately we have
the ideologues who think developers are purely evil.
Yes, unfortunately, there is far too much of that in certain urban planning thinking, which is completely unhelpful to actually good outcomes. But I think the bottom line for us is integrated transport and land use. Doing it well is really important if you can. It's hard.
It's really hard. It's
really hard, which is why so few places do it well.
All right. Well, hopefully everybody's found that discussion enlightening, and including our side diversion into whether traffic engineers are good people or not. And as always, please share the podcast. If you're feeling generous, buy us a train ticket or a bus ticket over on Patreon, and we will see you next week. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you, Graham. It was great talking as always. Speak to you next week.